Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lau. I'm from Ellen and Overy's International Arbitration Group. I'm also an executive committee member of the Rising Arbitrators Initiative. For those who don't know, the Rising Arbitrators Initiative was established last year. Our mission is to support arbitration practitioners under the age of 45 who have received their first arbitral appointment or are people who have substantial arbitration experience and are likely to be receiving their first one soon. And among other things, we hope that RAI could create a network and provide useful resources to support young arbitrators and encourage an exchange of ideas in relation to getting their appointments and practicalities of acting as arbitrator. So the RAI has been running an interview the institution series, and we're very delighted and honored to have the opportunity to have this chat with Mr. Lawrence Ngugi today. To give a brief introduction, Mr. Ngugi is the registrar and CEO of the Nairobi Center for International Arbitration, and as CEO, he leads the secretariat of the center. Mr. Ngugi is also an arbitrator and accredited mediator, a member of the International Council of Commercial Arbitration, a member of Kenya's representatives to the UNCITRAL Working Group 2, Arbitration and Conciliation, and UNCITRAL Working Group 3, Online Dispute Resolution, amongst other appointments. So thank you very much, Mr. Ngugi, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. So I will start straight away with my first question. My first question is, what do you or the NCIA as an institution think of the Rising Arbitrators Initiative?
Joan, let me begin first by appreciating the opportunity that the Rising Arbitrator Initiative has accorded me and the Nairobi Center for International Arbitration to be speaking with you today. It is a great honor to have this opportunity. Yes, as you ask, what do we then think about the Rising Arbitrator Initiative? Let me begin by mentioning it's no longer a secret. The image of an international arbitrator has long been defined to be a gray-haired male Caucasian. And this figure has typified what you may regard as a dominance of the industry by a few, which has created, in a sense, a feeling that there is a glass ceiling that the outsider faces a steep challenge to penetrate, which therefore has minimized the opportunities for the aspiring, or as you call it, rising arbitrator. So as NCIA, we applaud the Rising Arbitrator Initiative, which in my view is a timely initiative to translate especially the diversity talk to action. As an institution, we believe in according equal opportunities for all practitioners. And we think this is good, in fact, if not quintessential, for the relevance of international arbitration in the globalized world and to the future. So if we regard this as one of the initiatives that will carry us to that future, we as NCIA support the initiative. In fact, that is why we have participated in your activities, as we did recently in hosting your webinar series for the Africa region on this 22nd of April 2021. We think this is an idea whose time has come.
Thank you very much for the kind words and the support for the initiative. I think what you just mentioned, the glass ceiling that a lot of people feel when they try to get their first appointment, that's something that's very real, but it's also encouraging to see that many institutions like the NCIA has been doing so much in this regard in helping rising arbitrators. The next question I have is, I know the NCIA, like some other institutions, the center has power to appoint an arbitrator when, for example, the parties fail to nominate one within the time limit, or when the NCIA is asked to appoint the president of the tribunal. I wonder if you can share a bit more with the audience on some of the statistics, for example, how many appointments were made by the center last year, or any trends that it's worth mentioning in terms of diversity, region, etc.
Yes, John, I can confirm that under Rule 7 of our arbitration rules, parties nominate arbitrators as a default position. This, in effect, promotes party autonomy. But we also acknowledge that whereas parties will often agree, as we have seen in our experience, they do not always agree on the subject of appointment, which is very critical to any arbitration. So to break a stalemate, this center, like similar centers of arbitration, has a mechanism whereby we exercise what one would regard as a residual power of appointment. In the case of the president of the tribunal, we do appoint as a default unless the parties have contrary agreement. So basically, this provision was meant to safeguard the principle of party autonomy, but at the same time facilitate the commencement of an arbitration. To your question, in the year 2020, I would say it has been a bittersweet experience for us. One, of course, the COVID pandemic disrupted early year plans with regards to registration of disputes, appointment of arbitrators, and facilitating the hearings. But to our good surprise, we also continued to receive requests to register arbitrations. In fact, when we look at the first quarter of last year to the second quarter, when the pandemic had hit at least Kenya, we actually realized that we had more registrations for arbitration than the similar quarter the year 2019. So that's why I say it was a bittersweet experience. We did experience a drop in the registrations as the year progressed, but nonetheless, we still did appoint, to my count, 10 arbitrators as sole arbitrators, and 3 arbitrators for a 3-member arbitration panel. So in terms of appointments, we wouldn't say it was a bad year as we may have expected given the interaction. Nonetheless, of course, given the plans we had for the year, we still did see a significant drop in the number of cases we'd have hoped to register. With that, the trends that emerged in terms of diversity and issues of region. So most of these cases were perhaps not unexpectedly, domestic arbitrations, meaning that the parties had a preference in appointing domestic arbitrators. Most of them were Kenyan. We had, in terms of distribution, about 7% of our appointments were women. Not very encouraging. We would have hoped to have a higher percentage like the previous year, which was about 33%. Whilst the figure for men for last year was 93% in terms of the appointments. One thing I might want to point out is that what drove these statistics was the fact that these appointments were party appointments. So the center did not utilize the residual power of appointment and therefore went with the nomination of the parties. That said, we have continued to consistently encourage, especially the younger and women, to be visible, to ensure that we attain the objective of having a balanced appointment statistic.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is an observation that I've heard elsewhere too, in that arbitral institutions, they're very they're trying very hard in trying to rebalance the gender imbalance in doing their appointments. Although very often, actually, in party appointed arbitrators, that gender imbalance hasn't been redressed in to the extent that people hope to see yet. So still some way to go. I also wanted to get your thoughts on, you mentioned just now NCIA, we respect party autonomy, although sometimes the center also needs to step in and make an appointment. My question is, what do you look for then when making an appointment?
Interesting question, Joanne. Before I answer this one, I think there's hope in terms of leveling the equality or the imbalance in gender and age appointments. Presently, as a country, we're going through a process of appointing a new Chief Justice, having the previous Chief Justice having retired. And one of the encouraging outcome of the process is that the nominee for appointment for Chief Justice in Kenya is actually a lady. That's 58 years since independence. So I believe there's hope. Something will happen. Maybe not soon, but the trend is already there. And so we can only look forward to better things. Back to the question, I believe sitting where I sit in appointment as a cardinal principle that one cannot separate the end from the start. Parties come to arbitration so that the process could give them a final settlement of their dispute, which is often what we refer to as an award. If they agreed, they wouldn't be in arbitration. So in the end, what parties want is an award that is enforceable, and that any appointing authority would bear that in mind in making the determination on what controls the decision to make an appointment. That being the case, there is no single dispute that is a cut and paste of another. Different factors will affect the dynamics of one case to the other. And so to answer your question, there is no golden rule that will apply to all the cases. There will be minimum considerations, which I'll mention shortly, but by and large, there will be special considerations given that each case will have its own dynamics. So every appointment for us is special. However, how do we then attain an objective, rational decision in arriving at the appointment of an arbitrator? Some of the things we consider, of course, is the method and criteria selected by the parties, which must be given effect. So if the agreement does have a method, does actually even propose names, as a center, we are under an obligation to give regard to that method first. Then we would look at the nature of the transaction. Is it an international dispute? Is it a domestic dispute? Further, if it is an international dispute, what are the circumstances of the dispute? What is the location of the parties? What is the location of the subject matter of the dispute? What are the languages involved? Is it a monolanguage, or is it bilingual? Is it multilingual in terms of the agreements? So nationality of the parties, the number of the parties involved, is there a potential conflict of interest, for instance, when the parties have nominated arbitrators, the names that they have nominated, is there a potential for conflict? And then, of course, the fundamental consideration of impartiality and independence. Now, this would be the general rubric of what we look at, but eventually, as I have said, each case will have its own unique circumstances that may then determine the end decision on who to appoint as arbitrator in the particular dispute. It could be the question of experience. It could be the question of the opportunity for the rising arbitrator to be involved in a panel. And all those factors will play a role in making that decision.
I see. Other than the factors that you just mentioned, are there any essential prerequisites to eligibility for appointment?
Well, I think one of the ones which I could mention is impartiality and independence. Irrespective of whatever other qualities the arbitrator will bring to the process, the first and foremost is impartiality and independence of the arbitrator. So anything that would impinge on these two qualities, of course, would disqualify one from eligibility. With respect to specific dispute, some of the things that I mentioned, especially nationality, there could be the consideration of qualification of the arbitrator to handle a specific dispute, international vis-a-vis domestic dispute. Within each of these fields, there are diverse questions that could be in dispute. Does one call for instance, experience in a particular area, marine, science? Would it be telecoms? Will it be the oil industry? So some of these things would be did change from case to case. But the first one on which we would not compromise on is impartiality and independence. And then, of course, the question of conflict of interest.
Mm. And this ties in very well with what you just said earlier about ultimately parties would want an award that is enforceable. So right from the beginning, those elements that you mentioned are essential. We understand that the NCIA has a panel of arbitrators, and one may apply to be accredited to that panel. My next question is, what factors do NCIA take into account in deciding whether to approve such an application?
Thank you, John. Yes, indeed, we do have a panel. But before even going into the panel itself, I may want to mention that the rules give the parties liberty. So choice of parties to determine who would be the arbitrator. So although we do have a panel, we do not restrict the nomination of arbitrators from our list. But as you will understand, this list does come in handy, especially when the center itself would exercise its power to appoint. With regards to the qualification or requirements for this panel, I would categorize it mainly into two. That's a trained arbitrator, and secondly, the experienced qualified arbitrator. So when we look at the trained arbitrator, we consider here the academic and professional training qualification. There, of course, will be varied parameters which we look at. The committee that considers these applications have set a criteria. There's recognition of institutions that offer training globally. There is accredited training that we as a center do offer and train in arbitration. Of course, there is the basic training that one would have in varied fields, diverse fields at degree level. And then, of course, that beyond just having academic qualifications, there's professional qualification. So the subject of whether one is a current member in good standing of a registered, a recognized professional body. The thing here we are looking at is, of course, often professional bodies have a mechanism for ensuring that the people they empanel meet a certain criteria, and even a criteria for especially dealing with questions of ethics and conduct. So relying on the accreditation that professional bodies already represent when they recognize one as a member, we also do look into that as part of the training. I could have in mind here the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and similar or like bodies. Beyond the training, there's the question of demonstrated experience, that having sat as an arbitrator in at least 5 or more cases. So when it's the domestic arbitration list, in domestic cases, it's an international arbitration. It's 5 cases in international arbitration. And that's really a minimum threshold that is set to determine the trained arbitrator. Then there's experience qualified. So one may not have the academic background of arbitration. For instance, not have a master's in international arbitration, master's in investment arbitration, and similar courses, but then they're experienced. And of course, here what we are looking at mainly is demonstrating level of competence. And this would come out from cases handled, writing. It could be one who is a prolific writer in arbitration, one who has gained recognition, is renowned in the field from different perspectives. And so all this is taken into account. And so whereas they may not have the academic qualifications that are direct to trained arbitrator, nonetheless, they still contribute to the decision on empaneling one to the experienced qualified arbitrator. And what then we have the last category, which is the mentorship arbitrator, where we are bringing in those who do not necessarily have especially the experience, and allowing for them to enter through a mentorship program that will allow for them to gain experience, sit in arbitrations, and that way, of course, develop the skill and perhaps eventually get the first appointment.
Thank you for that. What I was going to ask was whether there is a single criterion that the center values the most, but from what I hear, it sounds like it's a very all-rounded approach. Every case is different, and actually every potential arbitrator or every current arbitrator is different in that they may have different backgrounds. Some may have more academic qualifications, but that may become others may have more, practical experience. So every individual is different, and they may, take different paths in ultimately ending up as an arbitrator.
Yes, I agree.
The next question I have, which also ties in with what we discussed earlier, is on diversity. Are there any specific measures that the center takes to ensure diversity in the appointment of arbitrators, whether it's in terms of gender, age, nationality, ethnicity?
Good question, Joanne, given that you are speaking about the Rising Arbitrator Initiative. And when I look at the age which you as an institution focus on, the 45 years or have 7 years since the first appointment. And when you look at it, really, you realize it's not even a question of age, because 45 in different cultures will not be young by any means. And yet, if we are talking about 45 as the age where we are starting to be concerned, we have this large group of people. For the case of Africa, if you think about the percentage of the population that are young, 45 is really up there. So we have, in most jurisdictions, the percentage of the under 25 would be in the upwards of 50, 60. So for us, the question of age, of course, the question of gender is a real issue, is a real concern. And so we have gone out deliberately, although as a center, or most typical centers will not focus on training and capacity development. So we have focused on that. We have engaged the universities, at least in the region, and we do have an East Africa regional moot run by the ncia. And what we are trying to tap into is this group of the young population leaving, especially the law school, and entering into practice. When I remember my days in university, arbitration was touched in passing. And so we entered into a field basically as litigators, and we only caught up with arbitration later. And that maybe in a sense has disfavored that generation. We do not want to see a repeat. So one way we have targeted diversity is to actually train. The other one is, of course, the often held view that some regions do not have a critical mass of arbitrators that could be called upon to arbitrate. And so we address that also through actual training. Now, again, this is not typical of arbitration institutions, but we have taken the bull by its horns and offered more than what would ordinarily be expected to do, which is just run cases. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, the question of mentorship tracking into the first appointment. And lastly, I could also mention that we then I do deliberately, when making use of the power, the residual power to appoint, deliberately give preference to address this question of diversity. When parties call for us to suggest names, to nominate, I will often have a one-third rule, that the names I will give to the parties must be representative of the opportunity that a third will be from one gender.
That's really encouraging to hear, like all the outreach or the mentorship opportunities or the training that the center is doing. My final question before we finish is, what do you tell arbitrators who are looking for their first appointment? Any tips for them, what they can be doing to improve their chances?
Well, Joanne, if you're looking for a magic formula, one, there's none. I do not have the magic potion on how to address the or appeal to address a first appointment. However, in my own experience, what I have seen is that first, one must go over and beyond to gain visibility in the field. You cannot dispense with the significance or the role it plays in offering one the opportunity to get the first appointment visibility. So how then does one become visible? There are many ways. One, participate as assisting or assistant counsel, depending on the jurisdiction where you are. So sitting in the team that is representing parties. That way you get to be in the room, you get to observe, you get to see the dynamics of a presentation of a case, you get to see the arbitrator's real life, you get to see the nuances of the case. And I mean, you will not replace the value of observation. So allowing oneself to be humble enough to get in through the door assisting. Maybe the other way, second way, would be participating in events such as webinars and conferences, moot events. The fact that one has left law school would not, especially in this field, would not be a reason for them not to want to participate in continual learning, so webinars and conferences. Joining support and mentorship networks, I would highly recommend the Rising Arbitrators Initiative, which is a global event, so to speak. Taking up publishing of articles and academic work. So if there are journals where one can write and get their works published, that's another area. And of course, be willing to always learn, especially given volunteering opportunities. A first appointment, then I must say, is a good start. But the first appointment alone should not be the goal, since in the end, each individual arbitrator must confront the reality that experience gained over time will count. So one cannot afford to ignore the value of experience over time. It may not be a barrier to enter, but certainly who will last in the field, who will persevere in the field, who will gain renown in the field will much depend on experience. So not to overlook the humble beginnings, not to ignore small cases initially, but to take every opportunity that comes and give it the best.
Thank you. Those are very wise words, and I personally benefited a lot from that. So thank you very much for sharing those insights. With that, I think our interview has come to a close. I want to thank you, Mr. Ngugi, and also the NCIA again for taking the time in attending this interview and being so frank in sharing your views and on the work that the NCIA is doing. And thank you very much too for all the support that your center has shown to the Rising Arbitrators Initiative. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Joanne. I express my gratitude also on my own behalf and that of the center for the opportunity to have been considered for this discussion today. We wish RAI all the best. We think you're doing a splendid, excellent job in raising the consciousness of our field to the need to have regard to the rising arbitrator. And I believe, as I said, it's an idea whose time has come. So thank you once again.
Thank you.